Hello there and welcome to The Ring, Euronews's brand new debating show broadcasting from the European Parliament here in Brussels. Once a week, two elected members of the European Parliament go face to face on some of the most pressing issues of our time. This week, we're discussing the EU's role in peace talks to end the war in Ukraine, and we're asking if we need to militarise European societies. Before we meet our guests, let's just get you up to speed.
So far, Ukraine and Europe have remarkably been sidelined in negotiations aimed at ending the war with Russia. US Special Envoy Steve Witkoff met Russian President Vladimir Putin to push a US-sponsored peace deal. Initially concocted with the Kremlin, the plan was amended with European and Ukrainian inputs after concerns emerged that Kiev would be pressured into unacceptable concessions. Yet, Europe is having a hard time finding a seat at the negotiation table. French President Emmanuel Macron welcomed Volodymyr Zelensky at the Élysée Palace and stressed that no agreement would materialize without European participation. Voices are also rising in Brussels for Europe to have its own plan to ensure a lasting peace in Ukraine and deter Moscow from future military action. Only the 27 can't agree on how to proceed.
So what next for the EU? And should the 27 remain a soft power or transition to a military might? The questions we'll be putting to our contenders. Let's meet them.
Cynthia Ni Moukou, Irish MEP for the Liberal Renew Group. A former journalist and lawyer, she's a devoted pro-European who believes in dialogue and negotiation under the right circumstances. Any credible peace plan must involve Ukraine, the EU, the United States and Russia, and it cannot be imposed on Ukraine or come at the expense of its sovereignty, territorial integrity or democratic future, she said. Christian Terches, Romanian MEP for the European Conservatives and Reformists Group. Former candidate for the country's presidency, a defender of national sovereignty, he has dismissed the guarantees given by the US, Great Britain, Germany and Russia to Ukraine in order to give up its nuclear arsenal in 1994. Now he warns against the acceptance of a peace agreement with Russia at any cost. In the natural tendency, man wants peace immediately, but history shows us the price of hasty decisions, he said.
Cynthia Ni Moukou and Christian Terches, welcome to The Ring.
Thank you so much for having us.
Hi, Christian.
Hi, Cynthia.
Great to have you with us. Well, look, ladies first, perhaps. We'll kick off with Cynthia Ni Moukou. Why is the European Union not at the driving seat in the talks to end the war in Ukraine, but always reacting?
No, the EU is at the driving seat, but the driving seat is shared and should be shared between the nations and the countries that have a vested interest. Obviously, we're in a particular space whereby America has withdrawn somewhat from its previous historical support through NATO and so forth. So we are in a new geopolitical atmosphere, as we all know, and therefore we are in the driving seat very much, but we can't take over in the driving seat. We also need our partners. So Russia is involved with the United States, and obviously we have Europe, but most importantly, we have President Zelensky and Ukraine. And in your clip, you indicated that the coalition of the willing, indeed, Zelensky was welcomed to the Palace Élysée, but he was also welcomed to my country and my parliament in the Dáil. And I can tell you that Europe stands firm, very firm with Ukraine, because I think my friend will agree with me, if we don't stand in Europe with Ukraine, who is next? Probably your country, Romania.
But messages of support, Cynthia Ni Moukou, are not enough. We have Kaja Kallas, she's the EU Foreign Affairs Chief, but she's nowhere to be seen in any of those images.
Well, I think European Union right now has to take the lead in this fight, because at the end of the day, it's not in the US main interest to resolve the situation in Ukraine, but it's in our own interest in European Union, and especially on countries that are on the eastern flank of NATO. As Cynthia rightfully mentioned, we are very concerned in Eastern Europe because if Ukraine collapses, who is next?
Yes.
It's someone from the Baltic region, it's Romania, who's next?
Messages of support is another thing, but has the EU done enough?
I'm sorry, Maeve. I mean, I watched the news overnight. Putin has withdrawn from the peace talks. Putin does not want peace. Russia does not want peace. Europe has bent over backwards in their very professional, organised way, bearing in mind we have 27 member states, and has really negotiated very skillfully and very hard. And I don't really accept any criticism of Kaja Kallas. She may not be seen in pictures, but I'm not depending on her being seen in pictures. I'm depending on her and her team negotiating hard, and they have been doing that. But bear in mind, they didn't withdraw. Putin
why
has
did the
withdrawn.
EU get
He's
sidelined
no interest
then?
in peace.
Why did the EU get sidelined by the Trump 28-point peace plan?
That's very, very simple. And I mean, again, I'm sure Christian will agree. President Trump has set up these so-called collaborative talks, which are not collaborative in any way because the United States did not come as the arbitrator, as the mediator, with its proposed plan drawn from both sides. He came with a Russian plan.
And we saw Steve Witkoff. He's been to Moscow around 6 times, but never visited Kyiv.
As you can see right now, we talk too much about what U.S. does or what U.S. wants. The question is what EU does.
Exactly.
And when you talk to Russia, historically speaking, you have to negotiate with Russia from a position of power. Because the only language that the Russian would listen to is the language of power. We talk too much, we don't act enough. Not only that we don't act enough, we don't act strong. I give you an example. Nord Stream 2, for example. When Trump was elected in 2016, he sanctioned the companies that were building Nord Stream 2. When Biden was elected in 2020, he lifted the sanctions. That's how Nord Stream 2 was finalized. Then we saw what happened in 2022. For so many years, there were so many talks, even here in the European Parliament. But behind the scenes, many EU countries, still conducted business with Russia. So
Christian,
we paid for these war premiums.
Yeah, I totally agree with Christian when he says about, not acting up quickly enough, because if we look back at the initial invasion of Putin into Ukraine, that's when Europe should have acted more comprehensively, more firmly, and they didn't. And we really are paying the price of that now. But I don't accept the premise that Europe is in some way too weak or way too ineffective. I do believe that progress will be made. Look at how Trump is stymied. Every time he says there's a deadline, Maeve, every time he says it's a deadline, that deadline is passed and we move to a next phase. He wants a quick fix. He won't learn the lesson, Trump, that we can't get a quick fix when he's asking Ukraine to give up its sovereignty. And then he's going to ask Romania to give up their sovereignty and Poland. And where I was standing in Estonia some weeks ago, looking across at the Russian border and realising how threatened all these countries on the eastern flank. But you know what? It's only a hair's breadth away from Ireland.
And you say, of course, the Kremlin only understands the language of power. How would you react to Vladimir Putin's comments this week when he said he's ready for a war with Europe?
I will not react with words. I would react with actions. We need to build up our defense. But on top of that, we need to set ourselves the proper mindset in dealing with Russia. And I paraphrase what the former Taliban leader told many U.S. generals when they had a meeting. The U.S. general said, well, we got to finish this fast. And the Taliban says, you know what is the difference between you and us? What? You have the watch, we have the time. So the Russians right now are using exactly the same strategy.
Yes.
Cynthia was right when she mentioned that Trump is always, coming up with these deadlines, from one day to another. You cannot have, in such a complicated situation, a peace deal from one day to another. In order to do that, you need to take, enough time to do it. But on top of that, you need to have a strong defense behind your words. So for many decades, the European Union expected that if something happens, U.S. is there to defend us. U.S. can help, but U.S. apparently right now cannot drive these anymore.
Christian, not only do we need to stand up and smell the coffee with regards to the mindset of Putin, which I think Europe did a long time ago when they failed to interact and investigate what was going on in the early 2000s, I should say, when Russia invaded first, Donbass, etc. But unfortunately, we have the mindset of Trump thrown in for good measure. And of course, we realise that all the power, all the might, all the money, which Ukraine has been so dependent on, as well as the huge investment from Russia, it's a very delicate balance. So, sorry, you talk about mindset. There still is a wonderful aspect of politics called diplomacy. But of course, Trump doesn't have that in his dictionary or his lexicon. It doesn't exist. And so therefore, Kaja Kallas and the negotiating team have to negotiate in a completely different way. It has to be deferential, it has to be sycophantic, and it has to allow the bully in the room to triumph.
Kaja's coming from one of the Baltic countries, and she had very strong statements, which is very important. But it's important also, she even mentioned in some of her speeches, to understand the lesson of history. The first country that was attacked by Russia in the 21st century was Georgia in 2008. because Georgia, in April of 2008, was not accepted in NATO because two NATO countries vetoed their accession. So what happened after the war in Georgia in August 2008? Russia occupied South Ossetia and Abkhazia, but in 2009, a new US president took office, Obama. The first thing that he did once he took office was to resume the relationship with Russia. Russia came with a precondition that said, and I quote, "You need to forget everything that happened to 2009. We start from scratch." Well, they do not start from scratch. They keep everything that they got so far, and from this point on, they want to negotiate.
But unfortunately,
back to Europeans, so our viewers watching
right
here today, Cynthia Ni Moukou, is it time to militarize our societies? Is it time for your voters, your children, to start learning how to fight?
I'll tell you what it's time for now. It's time to realise that the cooperative military organisations that we have in relation to procurement, in relation to training, in relation to sharing intelligence, that needs to be ramped up. And yes, Europe has already reacted to the fact in the last couple of months that the budget of each country, we have to commit a certain percentage.
Should we have voluntary military conscription for all Europeans?
Yes. And we need to understand that the biggest security guarantees that any country has, it's its own military. No foreigner and no stranger is going to come and die for your country. And we politicians, elected officials, we need to make this point very clear. Nobody is going to come and die for your country. If you, whomever you are, in what elected office you are, you need to make this clear to your people. So you have to build up your country to be resilient to any kind of interference from outside, either military interference, electoral interference, any kind of malign interference. So building up your military is one step, but not the only step, because we need to defend, for example, and make sure that we safeguard our correctness of the electoral process, for example.
But we also need negotiation, Maeve, and we need diplomacy.
So we need both.
Those two elements which Trump doesn't like.
Let me stop you there, because it is now time to take the gloves off here. That means, Cynthia and Christian, you can challenge each other directly, just like you do in the hemicycle. Cynthia, you can kick off with your very first question for Christian.
Certainly. Are you worried at the statement of Putin overnight, which stated, if Europe want war, we are ready for war? And how do you think Europe should react to that statement?
I have to say that Putin said it from 2007, fall of 2007, in Lisbon during a summit between EU and Russia. And he said something, and I paraphrase him, if the international community is going to recognize the independence of Kosovo, all the frozen conflicts from Eastern Europe are going to melt. And he nominated South Ossetia, Abkhazia, Nagorno-Karabakh, Transnistria. So that was fall of 2007. We saw what happened in 2008. We saw then what happened in 2014 and what happened in 2022. He's tricking us with words. Russia was preparing for this war not from today or from like 2014. Russia was preparing for this war a few years after Putin took power.
So what should the reaction be?
Well, we need to react. You need to prepare yourself for war. You need to not to attack someone, but to be able to defend yourself.
Because is that not scaremongering? Are our viewers not sitting at home fretting?
I'm not scaring anybody. I'm realistic. Look at what Churchill said, for example, during the Second World War. It's exactly the kind of leadership that we need and we are missing right now.
I think we need to have a nuanced, mature conversation with our voters, whether we're on the western periphery in Ireland or we're in Estonia and we're right up against it, the country of Kaja Kallas. We need to have a mature conversation about the militarisation and the investment in militarisation. No, it doesn't mean a united European army, but it does mean massive cooperation, massive investment.
But can we afford it? I mean,
we will have to afford it, even though there are competing interests, whether it's farmers, which are very dear to my heart, whether it's businesses, whether it's education, Erasmus. But right now, at this point in time, we are under threat. This is the closest we've been to the Cold War that I can remember.
Christian, your question now for Cynthia?
You were mentioning about the price. I have to say that it's cheaper to invest in your own defense than to support a war. And we see the situation in Ukraine. It's way cheaper.
Christian, your opportunity now to address a question to Cynthia Ni Moukou.
Yes, considering
I hope it's a simple one.
Well, we'll see, So do you think EU could have done more to help Ukraine? And if so, what?
Absolutely not. I don't believe they could have done more. I think the amount of money that Europe has put in, more than the United States, and the amount of talks, time given to talks, preparation given for talks and leading out, they couldn't have done any more. I think they have ramped up and reacted with regards to the commitment of the member states to their military spend, to their defence spend. I don't think with 27 member states who have very different constitutional setups and structures, I don't see how Europe could have done more. Are we perfect? Of course not. I'm not suggesting that. But sorry, this is in real time, Maeve.
But certainly not enough has been done, Cynthia, if we're entering now the fourth winter of war.
Ursula von der Leyen, and I wouldn't be the biggest fan of Ursula von der Leyen or President von der Leyen, but Ursula von der Leyen has reacted as swiftly as she can to a devastating new geopolitical situation that Christian has referred to, which is no support anymore from Europe, stand on your own 2 feet, get on with it.
Well, would you agree with Cynthia?
Up to a point, yes, but I think EU could have done more sooner, because now we have the 19th package of sanctions. Many of these sanctions could have been done right at the beginning of the invasion of Ukraine by Russia. On top of that, we could have cut their finances. Even right now, for example, the transportation corridors, for example, from Central Asia and China, all the goods that are coming to Europe, they are still coming through Russia, which is absurd. So on one side, you're claiming, and rightfully so, that Russia declared war to Europe. On the other side, you do business with them. It doesn't make any sense. This is what I'm calling on public officials, to be correct and to be straightforward with the population, because it's the only way to be able to properly defend from these kind of attacks.
And briefly, what leverage do the Europeans have over President Trump, for example, who seems to trust the Russians more than he does the EU?
I think the leverage that we have over the United States is to show the United States that we have heard the message loud and proud from President Trump. We are standing on our own 2 feet and we do have a plan. But Christian is right. There can be certainly a ramping up, particularly in relation to the financial sanctions, a ramp up of that, instead of having so many talks about talks. Now, bearing in mind that some countries in Europe are more adversely affected if we do impose the trading sanctions. So we have to be careful that we don't create another crisis. But you're quite right. Perhaps more could be done in that regard. But with regards to America, I think Christian is right. We have to stand up with a powerful voice. Kaja Kallas is doing that. She's doing it in a feminine way, which obviously juxtaposes against President Trump, who's calling journalist Miss Piggy on Air Force One. But at the same time, I would prefer to have her leadership rather than the likes of what we're seeing across the pond.
Cynthia, we're a big fan there of Kaja Kallas. Look, we've heard some points of view from our MEPs here, and now I would like to bring in another voice. And I'd like to bring in the voice of Ben Hodges, the former commanding general of the US Army Europe. Speaking to me earlier here on Euronews, he said the US really sees Europe as inconsequential, except maybe for some business purposes. Europe, he said, is slowly waking to the realization that they cannot count on the US to be a fair interlocutor here. Christian, are we inconsequential?
Up to a point, yes.
He said we're fourth on the list of the priorities of the Americans.
Yes, because for so many years, we allowed ourselves to be fourth on their list. Trump said, when he was asked recently or a few months ago, what is his position on Ukraine and how the U.S. is going to react to what is happening there, he said, there are two oceans between U.S. and Russia, which geographically is correct. There are two oceans, Pacific and the Atlantic Ocean. It should be us, the Europeans, the driving force of the peace deal in Ukraine. And we are not right now, because we talk too much and we act soft. Russia, this is the important, look, every time when Putin speaks, he makes reference to certain historical events. Russia developed a technique to twist historical events to their favor. They use that in a way to shape the narrative and to influence the population. We come with this sometimes tough talks, but with soft actions, and we speak and we talk publicly about immediate consequences. Let's do something right now. They have the time to wait, and then when they make any reference to history, they twist what happened in the past.
Can I just say, Trump has forgotten that he's got a major trading bloc and he's got major economic ties to Europe. And he's kind of forgotten about that because he's speed dating China and he's speed dating Putin. But he's after finding out now, he's after sending Jared Kushner, his son-in-law, and he's after sending Steve Witkoff and so forth. And they're after being given, as we say in Ireland, the bum's rush, the shut door. They're gone now. And their proposals about more business ties between America and Russia have come to zero. And now Trump is going to think, we do have an awful lot of dependency in terms of our business benefits from Europe.
And interesting this week as well, NATO foreign ministers gathered in Brussels without the US Secretary of State Marco Rubio around the table.
Correct.
A very unusual move. But on that point, we can close this conversation to take a very short break here on The Ring. But do stay with us because we'll be back very soon with some more political punch from the heart of the European Parliament.